This 4th of July marks the nation's 240th birthday. In 1776, the Continental Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence. But one of the founding fathers and second president, John Adams, didn't think that the 4th was the right day to commemorate the start of our nation. Kenneth C. Davis is a historian and author of Don't Know Much About History. Kenneth, welcome to the table today. So excited to have you.
It is always a pleasure to be here, and John Adams was absolutely correct.
So what's the deal? Why are we celebrating it on the 4th?
Well, Congress actually passed a resolution in favor of independence on the 2nd. John Adams went home that night, wrote a letter to his lovely wife Abigail saying the 2nd of July will be a day we'll commemorate with pomp and parades and illuminations, by which he meant fireworks. And he was right about everything but the date, because 2 days later, the Congress adopted Jefferson's declaration, which explained the reasons why they had that vote 2 days earlier. But when American people saw the declaration with the date at the top, July 4th, it instantly became recognized as the birthday. John Adams, by the way, did not celebrate the 4th for the rest of his life.
I was going to say, he stood his ground. He was like July 2nd, right?
He stood his ground, but he was alone in that pretty much.
Well, maybe he just liked to keep the party going. Just go the 2nd to the 4th.
Well, we can make that argument that we should have, this should always be a 3-day holiday.
Oh,
but,
I like that. You know, fireworks, such a huge part of the celebrations across the country. Where did that tradition come from?
Well, fireworks are as old as gunpowder, and the Chinese, of course, invented gunpowder, and almost immediately it became a way to celebrate or mark, especially the idea of bringing in something new, like a new year or the birth of a new country, and the fact that it's kind of like war without the war. And that's an important point to remember. 1776, the nation is already at the war. Let's set the scene a little bit. When these 56 men are sitting down, they are in open rebellion against the most powerful man on earth. We sometimes take that for granted, that these men who say we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor were really risking everything. They were politicians, but they were doing something very brave.
You mentioned John Adams, by the way. I always found this one of the most fascinating parts of American history, that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, these two men who tussled so much over the course of their political careers, both then died on July 4th.
An incredible coincidence of sorts. The 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration, they both died. They had been, of course, very close allies at Philadelphia in 1776, became bitter political rivals. Jefferson, by the way, we were speaking about vice presidents, was Adams's vice president, right, even though they were of different views. Later, they became friends again and die on this day. People thought this was divine providence.
And had this wonderful series of correspondence in their later years.
That's right. Again, after a very bitter alliance. By the way, I'm reminded of the discussion of the vice president that someone once asked about being the vice president and said, I'm opposed to vice of any kind. That's generally been the view of most people suggested for it. But this is about the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson's words. He changed the word happiness from property, by the way, because that at the time implied slavery. And this is the other important thing we have to remember, the great contradiction here. Jefferson had written about slavery in his draft of the Declaration. It was removed by Congress. They did not want any conversation about it.
Other than life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, though, there are some other things that you point out that you feel as though Thomas Jefferson wrote that were so important.
Well, they were radical ideas at the time, even though they weren't necessarily his. Certainly the idea that we are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the idea that all men are created equal. Well, certainly in England, all men were not created equal. There was an aristocracy. But last and most important was this idea that governments are formed with the consent of the governed. This was a time in history when people believed that the king or the church was in charge. To have this idea, again, not Jefferson's original idea, but he voiced it, and that was the founding ideals. Still, this contradiction exists, but we have to realize that 240 years later, that's an extraordinary moment, not only in American history, but world history.
Well, history repeats itself, too. Is there anything in this presidential election right now that you see that we could look back on history and see bubbling up now?
Absolutely, and this is the real reason to study history, to connect past to present. When you talk about immigration, Jefferson wrote about immigration in the Declaration. It was there were 9 immigrants who signed the Declaration. That was an issue back then. racial equality, where certainly an issue today at the heart of the Declaration. And finally, also religious tolerance. One Catholic signed the Declaration, only one of the 56. Catholics were not very well tolerated in America at that time, and we forget that these guys weren't always on the same page.
And really quickly, by the way, we talked about Hamilton before. Jefferson used that immigrant status to attack Hamilton many times over the course of their bitter disputes.
That's one of the reasons that he attacked him. There were many others. And by the way, I wrote a book about Lafayette and Lawrence and Hamilton. If I only knew how to dance and rap.
I know, think of the money. Kenneth Davis, thank you so much.
Thank you, and pursue happiness.
Absolutely.
Good
You
point.
as well.